Welcome to today's video. I'm Anna. I'm the founder of Ara Women, which is a platform for women's training where we focus on pregnancy, postpartum, and beyond. And we really look at strength, mobility, all things movement. So go and have a look at my website. If you haven't, that's arawomen.com.au, and that's linked below. You can follow me on Instagram at ara.women.au, which is also down below. And let's get into today's topic, which is returning to running postpartum. Okay, we might begin. So welcome to today's video. And today I wanted to focus on returning to running postpartum. So this is a big one for lots of women, and lots of women that I work with do want to get back into running at some point, but it can be a bit of a tricky one because how do you start? Where do you start? There can be some fear of injury, especially if there's been any pelvic floor issues or any birth injuries and that kind of thing. So I get it, wanting to get back into it, but there are a few things to keep in mind when embarking on the returning to running journey. So the first one, I've just got a few notes here, so I will refer to those just so I don't forget anything. Written a few things down. The first one, the big question is when? When do you return to running? So the research that we have currently really suggests that it's best to wait at least 6 to 12 weeks. So this is really about that healing time for the body. And this is where the 6-week check comes from, where we want to allow the body to do a lot of its natural healing before we add intensity and load and all those things back to the body, because it's been through a significant process, birth, a pregnancy as well. So even if you've had a C-section, that doesn't give you a out of jail free card for pelvic floor recovery, because the pelvic floor has held the weight of that pregnancy for 9-ish months, depending on how far your pregnancy got. So there is that tissue healing time. I would argue that 6 to 12 weeks is still really early to start running. People do, and everyone's journey is quite different. So that's also a big one to keep in mind, that you can't apply the same rules to everybody. You just can't. It might actually be fine for one woman to return at 6 to 12 weeks to running, and for someone else that is going to cause some big problems. For myself, so in my first pregnancy, some 13 years ago, and birth and postpartum, I didn't know much at all, and I hadn't seen a pelvic physio, and I just kind of winged it, and I started running quite early. I started high intensity training quite early, and I didn't do any other rehab type stuff. And I did end up with some stress incontinence, which is where you have some urine leakage under stress. So like running, coughing, sneezing, jumping, etc. And I do really think that that was down to the speed at which I got back into high intensity work without a structured approach at all. In my second pregnancy and postpartum, I took a much more conservative approach. So that was just a couple of years ago, because I was armed with a lot more knowledge this time around. So I actually stopped running in pregnancy quite early. And that's another debate, but that's what I chose to do. And did other forms of exercise and cardiovascular exercise. And then I waited around 6 months to get back into running. Also a personal thing. So there is a real varied timeline, is basically what I'm trying to say. And seeing a pelvic physio, a women's health physio, is a really good idea, because they'll be able to give you a lot of information about where your body is at individually to getting back into it. So that was a bit of a rambling way of saying that at least 12 weeks, but potentially longer depending on your body. Okay, so that's that one. What to do in the lead up to getting back in. So just because we're going to wait a few months or longer does not mean that we do nothing in the meantime. So there's a lot that you can do to prepare the body and prepare yourself for getting back into running. And this includes in that first 6 to 12 weeks, it's about the rebuild phase, reconnection and rebuilding. So this is where we focus on our diaphragmatic breathing, our gentle core work, our mobility work, our pelvic floor engagement and coordination work. And it's also so important to do that in that time and starting to get back into walking and all of those types of things. So there is a lot you can do. And then beyond that first 6 to 12 weeks, we start to bring in more structured strength training, start to bring in single leg work, plyometric work. So running is essentially a single leg exercise. And so practicing single leg exercises, strength exercises, and plyometrics, which is just jumping, hopping, all that sort of thing, prepares the body and especially the pelvic floor for more higher impact exercise. And we do those in short bursts. So we're just doing, a couple of rounds of, say, 5 to 10 repetitions or a minute work and then rest. So we're giving the body time to adjust and adapt to that new load before we're asking it to go for, a run for a couple of kilometers or more. So that is definitely the place to start. And also, rotational exercise is another one I just wanted to mention because in pregnancy, we lose a lot of rotation. This is through the spine, especially the T-spine, so the upper part of the spine. And this is because the spine and the upper body become quite bracy and blocky because of the growing weight of the uterus to support that growing weight. So that we lose that rotation happening naturally through the spine. So we want to bring that back in too because running requires a lot of rotation. And rotation is important because of the way that the load is carried up through the body and the way that the body transmits that load all the way from the ground all the way up. So we don't want to be too blocky and stiff in the upper body. So rotational exercises, which I teach a lot of, are things like twists, rotations, squats with side reaches, all of that sort of stuff. So that's a big one. So then, okay, we've done all of that. We've waited our time. We've done all the prep work. Where do we go from there? How do we actually start running again? So this one is important. Now I'm just going to pull up so that I don't get any of it wrong. I'm going to pull up the exact guidelines. Okay. So the real gold standard for that we have currently for returning to running is the returning to running postnatal guidelines by Tom Goom Gráinne. I think that's how you say that. It's an Irish name, and Emma Brockwell. So this article is really good. I'd recommend you going and reading this article if you want that deeper understanding, and I'm going to pop the link for that in as well. So in that article, there is a number of things, a little sort of assessment or test that you can do to see if you are ready to return to running. And I'll read those out now, and you can also have a look at those yourself. So that is number one. Can you perform these things without symptoms? So that might be feeling of heaviness or bulging in the vagina, urine leakage, that sort of thing. So, and we can go over some of those too. So can you walk continuously for 30 minutes? Single leg balance for 10 seconds on each side. So just can you balance on each leg for 10 seconds? 10 single leg squats on each side. So this doesn't have to be full single leg squats like a pistol squat, but this needs to be just to a target, so to a bench or something like that. And can you do that without falling and wobbling and all of those things? Jogging on the spot for 1 minute, 10 forward bounds, so just kind of skipping bounds, 10 hops on each leg, and then 10 running man repetitions on each side. So that's where we have sort of opposite arm and leg up, and we're switching like that. So bouncing on each side. So you can do that little test for yourself. Can you do all of those things without symptoms? And then you're ready to go and try your first run. On the first run, sorry to kind of break it to you, but the first probably 6 weeks, if you are going to do it the way that I recommend, is not going to feel super sexy and exciting, and like it's going to feel slow, and it's actually going to feel more like walking mostly, because a really good way to start is to do walking for 4 or 5 minutes and then run for 1 minute, and then walking again for 4 or 5 minutes and then run for 1 minute. And you do this, perhaps you repeat that, 2 to 4 times on the first run. So it's not going to be a very long run. It's going to be like 10 minutes, and most of that is going to be walking. And you will have run for a couple of minutes of that, depending on how many rounds you do. But I would recommend starting with 10 minutes or so, or less even. And then you have a rest day. And then the following day, you go again, and perhaps you add one more round. So if you did 2 of those, you're doing 3 of those. And then you have a rest day, and then you go again. So you're never in that first block of sort of 6 weeks doing 2 consecutive days running. You are just having one run day, one rest day, or a couple of rest days, and doing, perhaps 3 runs a week. Then you start to gradually increase. So you would decrease the time you're walking. So if you were doing 4 minutes of walking, you would do 3 minutes of walking and 2 minutes of running. And then you do that, but you cut it back to, perhaps 3 or 4 rounds of that, and then you add on. So that's kind of what it looks like. And so you very gradually increase the run time, and very gradually increase the amount of sets of that you're doing. And you're always gathering information whilst doing this. So perhaps one day, I did an extra set, but on that last one, I did leak urine at the end. And so that was maybe a little bit too much right now. And so I cut back, and then I try and increase again the next week, or I have a couple of rest days and try again. So you're just gaining information. If you're feeling really good, all the runs are feeling awesome, there will be a temptation to kind of rush ahead and go, oh, I'll just do, I'll just go for it and go for a couple extra Ks or whatever. Try not to do that, because that's where you can actually set yourself back. If you're really strict with a gradual approach for the first 6 or so weeks, then you really will be able to ramp up. It does take a slower approach initially, which can feel frustrating, but it definitely is the safest way to make sure that you don't get set back with injuries. So that is kind of the structure. A couple of other things: start on the flat, so don't go straight to hills. Starting on the flat is important, just to not add too much extra stress to the body. Good shoes. So I actually run in barefoot shoes, but that does take some adjustment. And especially starting off postpartum, it can be a good idea to have a bit more support in your shoe. But make sure you got some good shoes, and they're not like, 15 years old from the back of the cupboard, that you actually do have some proper shoes. Uh, Leaning forward. So we'll go through some posture. We'll go through some posture now as its own thing. So running posture. So this can make a big difference with how load is transmitted through the body, like making sure we have some rotation. And we'll get to that as well with running with the pram. But a big one is a slight forward lean, because slight forward lean allows everything to be stacked properly. It helps us to be able to stack the rib cage over the pelvis, which I go on about quite a lot. And it just helps to be able to activate through the glutes as well, and the hamstrings, and the whole, the core, everything can be connected with that slight forward lean. We want relaxed shoulders, not hunched up around the ears. And then we also want no gripping or clenching through the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor is just going to respond as it needs to. We don't need to be thinking about doing any sort of lifting or engagement through the pelvic floor with running. We just want it to respond to the movement and the impact as it needs to, and it will. That's what it does with everything. So, well, the other thing is we can take some smaller steps. So instead of trying to reach out with the stride, we just take some smaller steps. And this can actually be a little bit less impact on the pelvic floor initially as well. So we can, reduce the stride, but increase the pace of the steps too. So they're the main ones with posture. And then I just wanted to touch on running with the pram, because obviously this is a great way to get your training in, your exercise, is to take Bob with you and get out for some sunshine and some fresh air. But I would have a few suggestions here. So if you are going to be running with the pram, I would really try not to have this as your initial re-entry to running. So if possible, if you can do that first block of around 6 weeks without the pram, then that is ideal. And the reason being, the pram, when we're holding on to the pram, it limits that rotation. And it can put us in some weird positions as well. So we can't access that optimal stacked position as easily. And like I said, it really limits that rotation, which can limit that transmission of load through the body. So if you can run without the pram or get someone to come with you and they can push the pram, then that would be ideal. We don't live in an ideal world, do we? So if you can only get out for running with the pram, then there's a few workarounds. I would really focus on that slight forward lean. Keep little bend through the elbows, keeping the wrists from cranking, so keeping them nice and straight. And think about that stacked position. And then also, what we want to think about with the pram is allowing some rotation. So usually we can access that by using one hand and then switching, so that we can still get that turn happening with the upper body. Okay. Also, the issue with the pram is the weight of it. So if you are starting on the earlier side of things, like the 6 to 12 week mark, then the weight of the pram is more load on the body. So personally, I didn't run with the pram till around 8 months postpartum, I think. And that's just me. I mean, I did a lot of walking with the pram, but I didn't start running with the pram until around then. And that was just, that worked for me. And I felt like that was what my body needed. All right, that is the crux of it. So let me know how you go with your return to running. There are a lot of available programs online that you can follow if you don't want to have to figure it out yourself. There's a lot of free stuff out there too, so just, sift through that with a bit of grain of salt. But if you apply the principles that we talked about, you can figure out what is appropriate and what isn't. And there are a lot of paid programs you can do also. So you can, start with some paid stuff which really takes you from A to B. And there's also some that I've seen that literally have, an audio track that you can put in and it says, you know, now we're running, now we're walking, etc. So it really takes you through, so you don't even have to have a timer going or anything like that. But otherwise, you can just have a timer on, like an interval timer type thing on your watch or something, which, has a 4 minute and a 1 minute rest type thing. So you can walk and run like that. So lots of options. Okay, enjoy and happy running. I love running. I used to do a lot more, but I just love it. For me, it's the mental freedom. You're getting outside. You don't need to do much prep. You don't need to drive anywhere. You can just go, and it's a beautiful feeling. And that runner's high when you start to get fit and you're feeling good. So I get it. And I am currently pregnant and I will be getting back into my running postpartum definitely and following these principles. So I'm right there with you. I do have a early postpartum program called the Rebuild program, which takes you from that early postpartum and builds the foundations so that after that first 6 to 12 week period, you are ready to get back into or start to get into the training that you want to do, whether that be running, whether that be lifting, sports, gymnastics, all the things. It really prepares you and lays the groundwork for those other activities later on. Okay, thank you so much for joining me and talk to you soon. Bye. All right. Enjoy your running ventures.